Welcome to the Spark Live webinar series, one component of our Spark Knowledge Mobilization Program. Spark is Children's Healthcare Canada's shared platform for advocacy, research, and knowledge. Spark Live is where we gather each week to curate, convene, and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community. Our goal is to spark conversation, ideas, and action. Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank our funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities, including this Spark Live bi-weekly webinar series. There are two options to join in on the live conversation. Questions and comments for our panel or presenters can be typed into the question box, or comments that you want to share with the audience can be typed into the chat box visible to all of our attendees. For those of you on Twitter, tag @ChildHealthCan on any webinar-related tweets or use the hashtag SparkLive. And to keep up to date on all of Children's Healthcare Canada's webinars and other activities, be sure to sign up for our weekly Spark News e-bulletin by visiting our website at childhealthcan.ca. Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. The Spark theme for January is Indigenous Child Health. I'm Paula Robeson, your host for the next hour. Children's Healthcare Canada acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made in shaping and strengthening this community, our province, and the country. Today, I'm delighted to speak with Dr. Margot Latimer and R Sylliboy to bring you Indigenous Child Health, exploring the Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing Initiative. Before we begin, I invite you to answer a few quick poll questions for us. Just to note that you'll have to answer all three questions in order to submit your response. Thanks everyone for participating. I see that responses are still coming in. While that's happening, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Margot Latimer is a settler Canadian with Scottish ancestry. She lives and works in the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. Margot Latimer is a settler Canadian with Scottish ancestry. She lives and works on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq. She's a professor in the Faculty of Health and is cross-appointed in the Department of Medicine at Dalhousie University. Margot is the CIHR Research Chair in Indigenous Health Nursing in Nova Scotia. She holds a scientific appointment at IWK Health. Start that one again. She holds a scientific appointment at IWK Health and is affiliated with the IWK Centre for Pediatric Pain Research. Since 2008, she has been working closely with First Nations communities to mobilize Indigenous knowledge and co-leads the CIHR funded research initiative, Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing, with R Sylliboy. As well, she's a co-investigator on the Chronic Pain Network and co-principal investigator of the Wabanaki-Labrador Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. R Sylliboy is Linu Mi'kmaq from Millbrook First Nation in Nova Scotia and is Executive Director of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance. This alliance helps to build support and awareness of Two-Spirit in Mi'kmaq and Canada. John is also the co-principal investigator of the CIHR-funded Aboriginal Hurt and Healing Initiative, the Chronic Pain Network, and the Wabanaki-Labrador Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research. John is currently enrolled in McGill as a PhD candidate and has taught courses at both John is currently enrolled in McGill University as a PhD candidate and has taught courses at both Mount St. Vincent University and McGill. During the presentation, we welcome you to converse in the chat box and type your questions in the question and answer box, and we'll pose those to our speaker at the end of the webinar. It's now my pleasure to pass the mic to John.
Hello, everyone. WLN NEIHR. Wada Bexi, SSONI, Millbrook, Titte Wigi Jibuktu, Aha. Well, that's all know him, the biggest new diola. Well, that's all know him, said Gudui Gunulu Masutio. Dandalu Diagnin in the Aboriginal Children's Certain Healing Initiative. Aha. Well, he did him, the biggest new dio. Jila Suktik. My name is John R, and I'm from Millbrook and Eskasoni, as the bio was kind of floating around saying. And then I live here in Mi'kma'ki, which is our ancestral territory, and I'll share that on the map. And I live in Djibouti. The city where I live is Halifax, called the Grand Harbor. So thank you very much. I speak Mi'kmaq, and I try to always honor the fact that our language is first and foremost our knowledge source. So part of what we're going to share today is from the worldview of being Mi'kmaq, and also perspectives that evolve from our worldview into health and in our understanding around what pain is, for example. So we'll share some of that, and then we'll also share through some of the stories what we've been up to get to that knowledge and how we conduct our process. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and I share sound, and I'll open it up here. Share. As you can see, this is Indigenous children, stories, strengths, and strategies for wellness. And we acknowledge that we are on various treaty lands across Canada, but first and foremost, honor the fact that we are in kinship, we are working and collaborating together, and that we have a treaty responsibility to do so, to make sure that we always move forward in a way that is respectful of our protocols, our knowledge, and our sources of our wealth of given back to the community. So that's part of the process. So, oops. Let me see. Oh. So locating ourselves, I'm going to share this map right here. It should open up. And if you look at the map here, we have, this is an interactive map that we have and we use quite often, and it has all of the interesting and beautiful languages of Turtle Island, what we call this area, Turtle Island. Where we're looking at is here in Mi'kma'ki. Mi'kma'ki includes Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and the Gaspé region, and also parts of Maine. So it says Mi'kma'ki here, or Wabanaki, which is the Dawn Land Confederacy, or the Land of Dawn, but it also integrates the Wolastoqiyik, the Innu, the Inuit, Passamaquoddy, and the Penobscot nations around the region. So it just gives you an idea where we're at with our project. All right, so if I go back here. So the ACHH is what we call the Aboriginal Children's Certain Healing Initiative, is working with communities to gather Indigenous knowledge and to make sure that we improve that healthcare experience and outcomes in the area of pain, but not only in the area of pain. We've since then expanded to understand what areas of wellness and well-being incorporates the overall well-being of a person, of a child, or a person altogether. And so pain is one element of that, but we understand that quite often is very, that comes from a very deficit approach to that. So we want to make sure that we honor the fact that there's, there's strength, and from those are those stories that we have been working with. So Tuait Seeing, this is foundational that we share this. It's the strengths of Indigenous and Western perspectives. And the ways of knowing in this process has been instrumental in getting to where we're at, because we're able to address a lot of the challenges and barriers in communication, for example, or even approach. Often the clinical world looks at only Western-based perspectives when it comes to understanding pain perspectives, and they're all written out in English. And the whole world around pain is quite literally controlled by the worldview of Western perspectives. And so when we use Tuait Seeing, it allows us to open up the conversation and expand our understanding from our perspective, the Indigenous world. And in this case, we're talking about, for example, Ulnuwe perspective, or I'm Ulnu, which is Indigenous. I speak the language of our people, which is Ulnuwisuri. And with that comes the embedded knowledge of who we are and how we live and how we know to build up to that worldview. And with that comes all of the foundations of knowledge, philosophy, the language-based knowledge around the area, the scientific approaches and knowledges that we have based on being Ulnu, and also the knowledge based on land and water and our ecospace where we come from. So that, puts into a huge understanding about what wellness is, what pain is, what those stories in fact want to tell us. So if you look at practice and policy research and education, if we looked at the Tuaitsin model, this is what we're looking at. So I'm going to open up this video. Okay.
Tuaitsin is very much, in my humble opinion, inherent in the Mi'kmaq way of thinking. I think it's imperative that we apply those lessons learned from our forefathers as to how do we weave back and forth in these two worlds in which we have to coexist without compromising the essence of who you are as a Mi'kmaq.
The sort of Western lens tends to be tactical and data-driven, but we know that people are a whole package of heart and soul and spirituality and beliefs. And so Tuaitsin combines that in a much more holistic way.
When we look at knowledge around how we understand pain and hurt, for example, we also want to address how we want to learn about healing, what it is about pain management that we know in our own traditions that manage our own well-being.
We need to educate healthcare providers to have a better understanding of the differences in the needs of services and supports that First Nations populations need.
We have to be really focused on what are the needs, the values, the desires and goals of the individual, and that's primary. And secondary is all the things we can do. So I think, the two-eyed seeing model is really about the whole human.
We're trying to bring those two perspectives together, and we've done that through different methods. So for example, we use healthcare utilization data to look at what First Nation community members seek healthcare for. And do they seek care for the same types of issues, and do they get care for the same types of issues?
And the community was taking part in that process. We're taking part in the training of clinicians, building curriculum, developing health context for understanding what it is that Aboriginal people go through when it comes to health and well-being, understanding the history behind some of the things that would have happened that help us understand who we are today even when it comes to our well-being.
That co-learning will create transformative change. And that's exactly what we need to move forward with our healthcare system and to support these children and communities to be healthy for the future.
When you invoke your Tuaitsin for a non-native person, I think it would be very, very helpful if they can just momentarily put on another lens so that as this exchange is ongoing, you will be able to then begin to train yourself as to how can I weave back and forth between these two ways of knowing.
So Tuaitsin in a nutshell, like I said, it's a whole foundation of knowledge, and the convergence and merging of ways of knowing really has been the way to move forward for our research and our collaboration with our communities. Our communities lead these projects, lead us into this knowledge exercise and how to do this properly. So, I'm sorry, the Indigenous folks, who we are is, a lot of people have an understanding of Indigenous people, but a lot of people don't really know that Indigenous folks are right there, right in front of you often. So where First Nations, for example, Mi'kmaq, Mohawk, Cree, there's Métis, and of course there's Inuit. And we have Indigenous people can be your neighbors, physicians, nurses, teachers, your children's friends, electricians, politicians. So we have all kinds of folks that we have to, take into consideration who we are. These dots on the map are what represents the Indigenous locations of where people live. So if you look at it, we're, the population growth of First Nations and Indigenous folks is approximately 4 times faster than non-Indigenous population during that same period. So that says a lot about the growth of our population and the wealth of knowledge that we can bring into the world of, let's say, pediatric pain, or understanding health perspectives, and also understanding how we would like to see that take place. A lot of the situation that's most challenging for us, of course, are the health challenges derived from social determinants of health, of which you would understand that, for example, poverty is one. We have a lot of people that are dealing with high rates of various areas that I won't go into, but we do know that, in Canada, compared to the rest of the non-Indigenous population, we have higher rate of pain-related conditions. So that's important that we understand that, and you can see some of our research indicates that as well. So if we look at a lot of why we are trying to understand this process, is we had to go back, not just look at what the Indigenous person says about their pain perspective, but we have to really look at the societal and the historical and the ongoing social determinants that are impacting our people. And a lot of it is impacting not only the overall health of the Indigenous child, but we're looking at the impacts by not addressing pain, for example, that can lead to long-term impacts in mental health. So that's important that we understand that. Now, for us to understand, a timeline, if you will, and this is a very linear approach. This is a Western way of looking at, this process, and it's a snapshot of Indigenous populations' existence in this area. We've been here for thousands of years. This only captures a little over 100 years of what's happened. But in those 100 years of what's happened to our populations, the detriment to our health and our way of being, and the erasure and the impact on our languages and the impact of our way of being has been because of these timeline of very Western approaches to how we should be involved in the fabric of Canada. The Indian Act, Indian Residential Schools, I'm sure you've all been listening to. We've looked at the 60 Scoop, of course, and this is for a lot of people new knowledge. Of course, Indian Residential Schools, the last one closed in 1996, but we know that these effects are ongoing. And then we have documents that are important that will provide a balance, if you will, bring the balance back, if you will, into our communities. And one of those is the UNDRIP and the TRC call to action, and then the report, of course, and then Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People with its report, and of course, the unmarked discoveries of graves. So these are things that are ebbing back and forth about who we are, and documentation of what's been going on. But imagine all the stuff that's not documented. Imagine all those stories that haven't been told yet. And then we've been asking, and we've been collaborating, and we've been, working with our communities to understand that perspective a little bit more. Moving forward. So, before we can get to any reconciliation when it comes to the cost to action, we have to understand that we have to really address the truth process. And that truth process is a painful re-triggering of a lot of stuff that happened to our communities, to our elders, a lot of people who are still living from early times of Indian Residential School and survivors, right to the intergenerational impacts that have been happening and the traumatic experiences that are continuing. And they're felt in all of these areas. Of course, we have process of colonization is very much alive. We have land dispossession, for example. We have ongoing oppression. We have all kinds of different expressions of that colonization that manifests into our health. And, you know, I've mentioned these already, but we have to understand that a lot of these understandings that we understand our perspective of health is very mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual. So that is not taken into account when it comes to understanding wellness and well-being of Indigenous people. So we have to understand that our way of looking at life is also very cycle motivated, like the life cycle. And so we often look at it from these realms we call mental and physical, spiritual, and emotional. And to understand how we look at pain, for example, has to take into consideration all the other parts, not just the physical part. And this is the conversation and dialogue we are having with clinicians across Canada, in our region, and also our communities are saying it's about time somebody's listening to us. And this is part of the process that we've been trying to understand is what's the truth behind pain then? So these documents, of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of People, Indigenous People, has, you know, the articles and the outlining important aspects of what we need to address. That includes the calls to action, also the calls to justice, and including the Canadian Pain Task Force, where we had collaborated and put our voice into this document and even challenged this process by saying, listen, you really have to include Indigenous people's voices here. And the only way to do it properly and respectfully and meaningfully is to engage our community. And they listened and they did. And so that was a huge process in that knowledge mobilization of what those perspectives are, but also put it into action. Oops. And so as we move forward, of course, these are some of the articles that you could look at in the UNDRIP. And interestingly enough, UNDRIP was signed by the majority of the 193 nations around the world. The last 4 signatories were, of course, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and yours truly, Canada. Canada was amongst the last to sign on to this. And currently, in fairness of, you know, that process, we are also one of the first ones to address UNDRIP, though. So a lot of the other nations have not known what to do with UNDRIP because it's very resource-based. And so our organization, for example, the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, is a recipient of UNDRIP funding to look at what are those ways in which we can look at the human rights and processes and justice from a two-spirit perspective. So, you know, we're all in process here, and you can look further into the UNDRIP by looking at the articles that are there. Some of these are related to what we're looking at here when it comes to pain. So in that process, we've been looking at the TRC calls to action is one of the important documents that we started with that overlapped with our process. But in fact, the TRC calls to action, Aboriginal Children's Hurt and Healing has been working with the communities long time before the TRC calls to action came to publication. And we relied on the leadership and the process by which our communities had established with our partnership. And we followed to a T what they thought was important and how we address all of these things, which in fact are the ways in which we're fed into the TRC, because the TRC reflects what the communities want, and those are our partners. So we were already ahead of the game when it came to this, but we just then confirmed this process when we started working with the TRC. And of course, the process by which the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks have calls to justice and understanding violence against Indigenous women and girls and the 2S LGBTQIA people is part of the ongoing dialogue that we need to do. These parts, for example, call on us to ensure that the rights of health and wellness of Indigenous people are addressed for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We have to look at providing adequate, sustainable, stable, equitable and ongoing funding for Indigenous-centered and community-based health and wellness services, for example, which would be at some of the places where we need to address pain, for example, and of course, look at the sustainability of these programs so that we continue to help children. As you know, Cindy Blackstock is in process of looking at the child welfare system in Canada, and these are all ongoing conversations that we have. The current government right now is negotiating whether they would follow those recommendations or not, and I think the next process is very sensitive, where they were saying that $20 billion would go back into compensation packages of some sort for those children that were not provided adequate services to, and now we're at a stalemate again. So I'm not sure if that's going to mean that we'll go back to courts or trying to see what that will do. But those are ongoing discussions that are taking place now. And thanks to these documents that are very important in determining how we can move forward in process. So when we look at some of those links, for example, and goals, and the Canadian Pain Task Force had provided specific goals that we can also look at. For example, we look at number 2, where people have equitable and consistent access to a continuum of timely, evidence-informed, and person-centered pain care and support across jurisdictions. That part about jurisdictions is critical in Canada for Indigenous people because, as some of you may know, we have federal funding that provides health supports via federal initiatives. It's not necessarily provided through province, where childcare can be provided through province for non-Indigenous folks. It's not the case for Indigenous folks. So that understanding of jurisdictions is important, plus other things that we're looking at. For example, research, we're looking at equitable access to services for all populations, but especially people impacted by pain. We have to look at over here, goal number 6, amplifying Indigenous-led change in healthcare systems. And we can only do that through our partnerships with Indigenous folks leading this process, but also collaborating at all levels when it comes to decision-making processes and looking at how we develop, for example, policies that are applied into our communities. And then all of that is continuing as a process by which we respect the Indigenous-led process, right? And that includes doing the research, also doing the policy development, also delivering clinical care. We have to make sure that we get it right. And that's the only way it's going to be a transformative change if we get to that point. So the Canadian Pain Task Force is one of those documents that can provide input into that. So here, I'm going to hand it over to Margot, who's going to talk about our initiatives and what we've been doing all along. And I'm going to continue just being your guide to the PowerPoints. Go ahead, Margot.
Thanks, John. So John's really covered a lot of information in a short period of time, which is fantastic. It's a lot of very condensed information that we could probably pull apart one slide at a time. So we recognize that it is a lot for an hour presentation, but we wanted to give you an overview of our story, the community stories, and how we came to doing this work. And so I think at the foundation of our work is our partnership with communities. This is Julie Francis. She's a Mi'kmaq RN and graduate studies nurse, as well as she holds the Cape Breton University ULNU, or Indigenous Chair in Health. This is her family. And so really it's just, we like to represent the work that we're doing, and partnering with communities is at the foundation of our work. We build trust by listening to address what communities tell us are their priorities. Our work, as John has talked about, has started out in the area of pain. We started by asking questions about pain, and that is a whole other presentation about what we've learned. But we are actually moving to the healing now. Communities have said we want to focus on change. We want to focus on the healing aspects. So you'll see in the work that I'm about to present how we're doing that. And we also are working on creating understanding within non-Indigenous people. So, and that's why we included all of those landmark documents for other people to use and to draw on how they can be involved in using the content in those. And obviously advocating for community-led change. And that's really a priority for us. Next slide, John. So some of the ways our team is addressing all of these landmark documents, and I also wanted to add the work that we've done with the Canadian Pain Task Force has also led to being involved with working with the Solution for Kids in Pain and the Health Standards Organization to contribute from an Indigenous knowledge perspective on creating pediatric pain management standards. So we're creating partnerships, as I've said, with Indigenous communities. So it's Indigenous people leading health system development and change. That's such a key piece of our work is making sure it's Indigenous voice and knowledge that's informing the change. And that is a change from historically where Indigenous people tend to be told what will happen. And so we're creating those pathways so Indigenous people can come into the health professions and lead this work, just like Julie. We are creating and evaluating cultural safety curriculum, including pain care related to work with pre and post licensure clinicians, policies to access traditional medicines in the health system, building on some of those calls to action, creating more accessible evidence-based pain care. And I'll talk a little bit about the clinics that we're working on. And then creating and sharing knowledge about Indigenous ways of knowing relevant to practice, but also research. Next slide, John. So in our work we did through using healthcare utilization data from Mi'kma'ki, determined that children and youth have significantly higher rates of physical pain conditions, and in particular ear, oral conditions, but also they were less likely to get mental health diagnoses from the healthcare utilization data, which wasn't consistent with what community members were telling us. So we know left undiagnosed, untreated, and improperly cared for pain can affect all areas of a child's life. So we got to work at figuring out with communities how to address those gaps. Next slide. So again, with our partnership and in particular knowing about the chronic ear issues, in our research, we determined that while children had significantly higher rates of chronic ear conditions, they were less likely to get a referral to an ENT clinic. So in one of our presentations, one of the pediatric ENT specialists stepped forward from our tertiary care center here and said, how can I help? I want to be able to help with addressing this gap. And so we started working between the pediatric health center and the community. This is our team for our first visit, looking at a potential location for the clinic. We worked with Nova Scotia Hearing and Speech and just began building that relationship. And we opened our first clinic. This is the largest Mi'kmaq community here. And we opened the first clinic in October, and we're now expanding to 3 other communities in that area going forward this spring. And so that was really about foundationally relationship building, but it was also using our research evidence and the trust of the community to work with us. So we like to talk about dual capacity building. And so sometimes there's an assumption that it's the community that needs to have capacity built, but really what we talk about is the tertiary health center clinicians and leadership also need to learn about how the community operates. So we've done some knowledge exchange between the Mi'kmaq nurse, who's now been designated from the community. She comes to the Pediatric Tertiary Health Center for the ENT clinic and has done some work there. And the nurse and the pediatric ENT specialist go to the community. And so it's just been an amazing experience so far. And it's the community that holds the data. They hold the patient-related data, which is really important for data sovereignty. And it was the community Mi'kmaq nurse who created the evaluation from a community perspective. So it'll be evaluated from the community, from the parent, in terms of what their successful markers are. Next slide. From an oral health perspective, we didn't lead this work, but a dental hygienist with a particular interest in this area worked with Dajigimic, who are the Mi'kmaq Health and Wellness organization here and in Nova Scotia. And so using evidence from our research and other research that had been done here with Mi'kmaq children, we wanted to have a proactive approach. And so they've created this book called Baby Smiles, and it's been translated into Mi'kmaq as well as English. It has a Mi'kmaq artist that's illustrated it, and it's online. It hasn't been officially launched yet, but you can watch the video, both the Mi'kmaq and the English version of it. And it's really such a cool experience. It's for new moms and and parents and guardians of young children using the oral health standards to help teach about healthy, what makes a healthy smile related to diet and management. So another way that we're helping sort of overcome that gap in knowledge is that youth and communities told us they have a very difficult time sharing their pain. And so communities said, well, what about creating an app? So we've been working actually for a number of years. It is a challenge to create an app. I was fairly naive when I began, but it's become something that's continues to be important for youth. So it's been translated into both Mi'kmaq and English. It's been tested in a large Mi'kmaq community here, and it's also being tested at the Winnipeg Children's Hospital pre and post-op with orthopedic group. And so again, this information is online. We don't have time today to go into all this, but again, this is a community-led initiative, and it has both a physical and emotional pain component where we're trying to capture what community youth are experiencing. And so it is something that gives them the power in their own hand to be able to share that pain. Next slide. So from a cultural safety perspective, as you saw in those landmark documents and primarily in the TRC calls to action, mandating schools of nursing and medical schools and health centers practicing clinicians to have a course on cultural safety. So we took the evidence gathered from communities and created a course in addition to other evidence. These are the 6 modules that are included in the online self-directed yet facilitated course. And so it's currently offered to all first-year medical, nursing, dentistry, pharmacy, and dental hygiene students at Dalhousie University. It's about 500 students a year. And it's part of the core curriculum, so they all have to take it. And we've taken that course and adapted it for post-licensure learners, clinicians in practice. And we're about to pilot that post-licensure version here this winter, and then once we pilot it with a small sample, we'll be expanding that beyond. But again, that's a community-led initiative. There are many community members who are part of that course, and as I said, it is facilitated also by community. Next slide, John. So we recognize, you know, people have called our team ambitious, what we're trying to achieve, but it's really, once you start the work, it's really difficult to pick off one particular area. We've talked about pain, but as we said, we really are focused on getting to the healing and the prevention. So in the communities that we've worked with across Canada, we've worked with Angela Navu, Rachel Van Every at Desjardins Aboriginal Health Centre in Ontario. We're working with Dr. Melanie Morris, Winnipeg Children's. She's a Métis surgeon, and we're really trying to understand, what a healing center looks like. And so both of these areas and these colleagues are working on this as well. And so in Ontario, this is actually a short video of Desjardins, how they've embraced that sort of integrative healing center. And I'm just looking at the time. So maybe what we might want to do is just finish the slides and see if we have enough time to play this. It's a short 6-minute video.
Yeah, we have about 8 minutes for 45-minute mark.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe play it then, John.
Let's play part of it, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that this is an amazing organization because we offer such an array of services and supports for all folks, from transportation to group activities to primary care, access to traditional healers. We do a number of things around mental health and addictions and homelessness. So this is a very well-rounded organization, and I'm very proud to be the executive director.
Welcome to our health center. Thank you so much. Welcome to Desjardins, our Aboriginal Health Access Center. We provide culturally safe and relevant services for the Indigenous community. The translation of our name, Desjardins, in the Cayuga language embodies the concept of taking care of each other amongst ourselves. In our clinic, we have nurse practitioners and physicians. As you can see, we've labeled our clinic rooms with clan animals as an identifier to incorporate our culture. Our clinic rooms are larger to accommodate appointments with families, individuals with assistive devices, and parents bringing in children.
So I'm a nurse practitioner in primary health care, and I've been with Desjardins for almost 6 years now. I'm continuing to learn things every day. I think I learn the most from the patients and what their experiences are, what their struggles are, what their courage and what positive things that they're bringing to the community and to their families. So I've always learned more and more about kind of looking at health from a more holistic perspective. I remember in my first week, and a patient had come in. They were in a bit of crisis and some distress, and they had asked me, "Do you have something that I can hold?" I didn't know what they actually meant, but later that patient actually taught me a bit about they wanted something to, whether it was some sweetgrass or whether it was to have a smudge or to have something sacred that they felt to hold on to. And so ever since then, I always have sweetgrass, I always have sage, and so I always try to have something here.
The image of the health center itself was they had meetings with local elders when we first opened, who guided us in what they wanted or what the community needs were for the health center. The foundation of how we provide services is relationships and understanding our patients and their story, using their story in the way that we provide care. Being able to provide traditional health services through ceremony and healing also addresses the emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical needs of our people.
Okay, I'll just put on mute there. And
Thanks,
then
Tom.
go back to.
Perfect. You can go to the next slide. So that just gives you a flavor of what we are learning and how we're gathering information from other people, but also focusing on the communities here. So through our collaboration with the Chronic Pain Network, we have some funding to begin this initiative here in Mi'kma'ki, and we have worked with one large Mi'kmaq community to start this work using, creating an integrative hurt and healing center as a pilot in one community. And so the first step was to go to the health board to get approval even before. So the Chronic Pain Network is a national research initiative. But before we could even agree to that, we had to go to the community health board approval to make sure that this was something that they supported. So as researchers, we couldn't put our name on that document until the health board approved it. And so that was part of the foundational process. We've engaged a Mi'kmaq health consultant to guide our strategic plan. And so we're just planning the community engagement to determine, just like Angela had said in the video, the communities designed the health center, and that's exactly what we'll be doing. Next slide. Yeah. Oh, I think you go back one, John. Oh, no. Okay, sorry. No, that's right. And so, as I said, we are researchers, and it started out as a research initiative. It's clearly, when we started this work, I guess we hadn't really anticipated that we would actually be doing all the implementation as well. We thought we'd be generating information, and hopefully that's what we're doing today, is giving you some ideas of how we've done this work. But we also recognize that people want to know how to do respectful research with Indigenous communities too, to gather the knowledge in a respectful way. So along the way, we have documented that experience and have published that. It's on our website, the ACHH website as well. So there's information there to learn about our process. Next slide. So overall, we just really are trying to help people understand the experience of Indigenous people, how that history has contributed to their experience, and from a child's perspective, or child and family perspective, what are the ways in which they've been impacted by this history and current. Actually, it's ongoing in terms of their experiences. So as clinicians or researchers, or whatever your role is, what has been the experience before they come into the healthcare system? And how can we think about that in terms of supporting Indigenous children and families? Next slide. So really encouraging you to think about your role. I actually just, when the video was on, saw one question about how do we actually do this? How do we work with our systems? So what is your individual responsibility within the system, within the organization you work, and the larger system? I would say it's knowing some of those landmark documents and being able to speak to them. You can hear consistently through our work, we have our relationship with community, and so we bring community in to speak for themselves. So it's the community sharing their priorities. We work from the 4 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. We all have a responsibility in this. I think there's some thinking that it's Indigenous people that have to create the change, but we need to, in the work that we do, we bring Indigenous voice in when people are ready for the change. And, just based on that question, I know we can hire Indigenous people, and it can appear as tokenism if they're not given the authority and responsibility and the resources, budget, etc., to make the decisions. And so I think creating that relationship with community in a positive way when they are, and when the system is ready to make those changes and accept and relinquish the control, that's what we've learned makes the difference. Next slide. We just, some afterthoughts for John and I when we think about how we have respectfully moved forward and had some success, I guess. Again, it's that partnering with communities to understand their priorities, integrating Indigenous knowledge, using the respectful principles, advocating from an Indigenous lens to build on that history and implement it into health and education, creating that space for understanding. And, you know, in reality, it's not all as easy as we've presented. We've been doing this for a number of years. Anticipate resistance when you start, but stay committed to the decisions that are always in the best interest of the community that they have told you that you don't make that decision. They've told you that that's what they need. So I guess the other part of this is we have fantastic partners that work with us, fantastic funders that really help us keep our work moving forward. They're purposeful funders, Chronic Pain Network, and partners like Solutions for Kids in Pain, who put us in places like the Pain Care Task Force, and IWK Health Foundation, Dalhousie University, CIHR. You know, I just want to say that we do our work because they have our back. And so that's a really important piece of it too. So thanks so much. We're happy to answer some questions.
Good timing.
Thank you both so much. We've had many really positive comments come through. I'll share them with you both after the recording along with our evaluation. But there's also been a number of questions from our audience. And while I get them sorted, we'd like to ask another few quick poll questions of our audience to help us improve our Spark program. Another note, you'll have to select all the answers, an answer for all 5 questions before submitting your response. While Jose is launching that and you folks are answering the questions, I'll start with our questions from the audience. Patty asks, I'm a pharmacist who has the privilege to see clients and provide care directly in a kids' rehab hospital. Do you have any recommendations on how I can better connect or communicate with Indigenous clients and families? Are there pronouns or ways of speech that I should be aware of? Specific body language, the sorts of things that will enhance good communication.
Thanks for that question. We had an article that says the first approach principles, where we talk about relational approaches to patient engagement in a clinical setting. So if you can look at those one way, but it's always having an approach that is relational building. So one example and one little thing that we do often is we say in our language, Medal Wale, you know, like, how are you in Mi'kmaq? And if you can learn some phrases of the folks that live in the area, that always releases people's tension. And we've seen that in our clinical situations when we had people have, for example, you know, being scared of needles, or somebody was scared of like going into their setting, and just speaking to them in our language, it just automatically dropped their shoulders to relax. And then, you know, they saw that we're there for them. And so those are just a quick anecdotal experience, but also making sure that you're at eye level rather than looking down at them in that space, and also asking permission to talk with them and say, you know, how's your family? How is your community? You know, it's things that are relatable first before going into the, you know, give me your pain scale from 1 to or 0 to 10 type of thing, right? So that's always important. So yeah, that first article that teaches some of that will be one way, for example, from a perspective of ours here.
Thank you very much. Lisa asks, do you have any specific recommendations or documents that discuss how to involve or take leadership from or get community involvement from First Nations and in other Indigenous communities? She'd love to hear about more resources if possible. And she's especially curious about the move from simply hiring an Indigenous or First Nations peoples into positions that is really tokenistic, into something far more meaningful?
So the first question, again, we alluded to another how to do protocols and follow some protocols in the community. This is based on our experience here in Mi'kma'ki with First Nations, Mi'kmaq First Nation folks here. But that gives you, a lot of it's quite pan-Indigenous when it comes to protocols, following protocols of relationship building, kinship building, making sure that you're establishing that relationship. So the communities led article can share some of those insights that we have experienced here, which we also shared in the perspective when we, went to Winnipeg or Hamilton, for example, and those other ancestral places. So that's one way. And the other is making sure that you ask. People are afraid to ask, just not assume anything and not assume that you know it all. That's the thing that we're trained in the clinical world to, go by what you know by training. But when it comes to Indigenous folks and relationships with Indigenous folks, follow Indigenous people and they'll follow their recommendations as well. If you want to add anything, Margot?
No, but I recognize the sort of the undercurrent of frustration in the question because I think health centers, health organizations, universities are now, being called, the TRC calls to action came out in 2015. So people are now saying, why aren't they being addressed? So people are sort of rushing to address them, but, and trying to find ways to do that. But if there isn't recognition on the part of the institution of what that really means, it does come across potentially as tokenism. And that's why I'd said that there has to be an acceptance that it's community-led, community-informed. And so finding those organizations, as John has said, who have that in their mission, those Indigenous organizations, the friendship centers, et cetera, who you might be able to work with in partnership and then go to your organization to start creating those relationships. It's the relationship piece that's so important first. We know, for example, with the Pediatric Tertiary Care Center that's here, they have it in their strategic plan to be able, that's a priority for them to partner with Indigenous communities. And so building on that strategy is a place to start. And then working with the documents that we shared today and creating that relationship with the community organization, I think would be some suggestions.
Yeah, and I think for researchers as well, you can add some of the OCAP principles that you can find online. There's OCAP, and of course, there's the tri-council approaches. So those frameworks, of course, with CIHR and SHRC have those outlined for the Canadian Institute of Health Research. You can find those for researchers per se, not necessarily clinical approaches, but is there anything else?
We're coming to the end, so I have time for one more question, but I wonder if for the additional questions, if I can share them with you, John and Margot, and maybe a brief response, and I can share them out with the group. Melanie wants to know, will the Baby Smiles book be translated into other languages?
That seems to be the request we've seen when we are working with content, even with the app that we're working with, for example, which is in Mi'kmaq, in our language, or Nuisuli, is being explored in other languages. In Winnipeg, for example, we're looking at it in, is it Cree or Anishinaabe? And so because it's translatable knowledge and things can be interpreted or translated, not always interpreted, not always translated, but interpreted. But there are specific pieces that are easily knowledge translatable. So I think that would be a question to the actual people that provided the book. But I think it's easiest it can be done anywhere, I think.
Yeah, I think that there would be interest in that. It would have to come from the community that you're working with, the language and the people who know that language. The objective of creating the book is to help Indigenous children, and it started with Mi'kmaq children here. So I think, we don't want to hold on to this knowledge. We want to share it respectfully, and we want other children and families to benefit from it.
Thank you very much. The comments that are coming in are how helpful this webinar has been to folks and how much they appreciate your time. But that's the end of our time together today. Thank you, Margot and John, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And thanks to our audience members for joining in. We know how busy you all are right now, and we hope you depart with some practical knowledge to bring back to your organization. Upcoming on our Spark Conversations podcast, on January 30th, we'll be releasing a podcast featuring an interview with Dr. Smart and Cindy Blackstock with regard to Indigenous child health. And we have in February, which will be Spark's Child Health Research Month, we have 2 webinars. One on February 8th, Advancing Pediatric Nutrition in Canadian Hospitals, an update from the Nutrition Pathway and Malnutrition Standard. And on February 15th, we have our colleagues from the Pediatric Inpatient Research Network, or PERN, speaking on delivering high quality care through patient and family partnerships in pediatric research. I hope you join us in February. And thanks again, Margot and John, for this really great presentation. Bye, everyone.